November 12, 1952, 3:17 a.m. Frank Sinatra sat alone in his empty apartment, staring at a piece of paper that would either resurrect his career or confirm that he was completely washed up. It was a script, just 8 pages. A small role in a war movie that most actors would consider beneath them. But for Frank Sinatra, who 18 months earlier had been one of the biggest stars in America, this script represented his last chance. His voice was gone, his record label had dropped him, his movie studio had canceled his contract, his wife had left him, and now, at 37 years old, Frank Sinatra was about to make a phone call that would either save his career or end it forever. What Frank didn't know was that the man on the other end of that phone call was about to offer him something no one else would. A chance to prove that being broken could make you stronger than you ever were when you were whole. To understand how desperate Frank Sinatra was in November 1952, you need to understand how far he had fallen. Just 3 years earlier, in 1949, Frank had been untouchable. His records topped the charts, his movies made millions, and teenage girls fainted at his concerts. But by 1952, the teenage girls had grown up and moved on to younger singers. Frank's voice, damaged by overuse and poor technique, had lost its power. He could barely get through a song without his voice cracking. The smooth, effortless sound that had made him famous was gone, replaced by a weak, strained whisper. Columbia Records, his label for almost a decade, had dropped him after his last 3 singles failed to chart. MGM Studios had canceled his movie contract after his recent films flopped at the box office. Even his marriage to Nancy, his high school sweetheart and mother of his 3 children, had ended when his affair with actress Ava Gardner became public. Frank was broke, alone, and convinced that his career was over. "I was a has-been at 37, Frank would later tell his biographer. "I'd gone from the top of the world to absolutely nowhere in less than 2 years. I was getting pity from people who used to beg for my attention. That's when you know you're really finished." But Frank's fall from grace had one unexpected benefit. It forced him to confront the weaknesses that success had allowed him to ignore. The vocal problems that he'd been masking with showmanship. The acting limitations that he'd been hiding behind his persona. The emotional immaturity that had cost him his marriage and many of his friendships. For the first time in his adult life, Frank Sinatra was forced to actually work on his craft instead of relying on his natural talent and charisma. "The best thing that ever happened to Frank was losing everything," observed Nelson Riddle, who would later become Frank's greatest collaborator. "When you're on top, you don't learn. When you're at the bottom, you either learn or you die." Frank chose to learn. The script that Frank was holding that November night was for a movie called From Here to Eternity, based on the best-selling novel by James Jones. It was the story of soldiers stationed in Hawaii just before the Pearl Harbor attack, and it was being directed by Fred Zinnemann, one of Hollywood's most respected filmmakers. The role Frank wanted was Maggio, a scrappy Italian-American soldier who gets beaten to death by brutal stockade guards. It was a small part, maybe 20 minutes of screen time, but it was the kind of dramatic role that could prove Frank was more than just a song and dance man. The problem was that nobody wanted Frank Sinatra in their serious war movie. Sinatra was box office poison in 1952, recalled producer Buddy Adler years later. His last few movies had been disasters. His singing career was over. He was in the tabloids every week because of his messy personal life. Why would we want that kind of baggage in our prestige picture? But Frank was desperate enough to try anything. He'd heard through industry contacts that Columbia Pictures was casting From Here to Eternity, and he'd been calling everyone he knew trying to get a meeting. Finally, through his agent at MCA, Frank managed to get 5 minutes with Fred Zinnemann. The meeting did not go well. "Mr. Sinatra," Zinnemann said, without looking up from his desk, "I appreciate your interest in our picture, but I don't think you're right for what we're trying to do here. This is a serious war drama, not a musical." Frank's temper, never far from the surface during those difficult days, started to flare. But something stopped him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the recognition that burning this bridge would mean burning his last chance. Instead of getting angry, Frank did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He got on it. "Mr. Zinnemann, you're right. I'm not right for this role. The old Frank Sinatra, the guy who coasted on charm and expected everything to be handed to him. That guy couldn't play Maggio. But I'm not that guy anymore." Frank leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time in the meeting, Zinnemann looked up. "I've lost everything, sir. My voice, my contracts, my marriage, my reputation. I've got nothing left except the need to prove that I can do something meaningful with whatever talent I have left." Frank's voice was quiet now, stripped of the cockiness that had defined his public persona for years. "Maggio is a guy who gets beaten down by the system but never gives up fighting. I know what that feels like now. I know what it's like to be counted out, to have everyone write you off. And I know what it's like to keep getting up anyway." Zinnemann studied Frank for a long moment. "Mr. Sinatra, even if I believed you could handle the dramatic requirements of this role, there's still the matter of your public image. You're known for nightclubs and love songs. Audiences won't buy you as a tough soldier." "Then let me prove them wrong," Frank said simply. "Give me a screen test. If I can't convince you that I am Maggio, then you don't owe me anything. But if I can show you that everything I've been through has prepared me to play this role, then maybe we can help each other." Zinnemann was intrigued despite himself. "Help each other how?" Frank smiled for the first time in the meeting. "You need an actor who understands what it means to fight for survival. I need a role that will prove I'm more than a washed-up singer. We both need this movie to be something special." 3 weeks later, Frank got his screen test. But what happened during those 3 weeks revealed the depth of Frank's desperation and his commitment to getting this role. Frank spent every day studying the novel, reading about military life, and working with an acting coach to prepare for the audition. But more importantly, he spent his nights in downtown Los Angeles, in the bars and pool halls where soldiers and ex-soldiers hung out. Frank would sit in these dives until 3 a.m., recalled Hank Sanicola, Frank's longtime friend and manager. He wasn't there to party or to be seen. He was studying, listening to how these guys talked, how they moved, what they cared about. He was learning how to be Maggio. Frank also did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He offered to do the screen test for free, not just for scale, but for absolutely nothing. If he got the part, he would work for $8,000, a fraction of his usual fee, and less money than many supporting actors were making. Frank was willing to pay them to let him audition, recalled his agent, Bert Allenberg. He understood that this was his last shot, and he was willing to do whatever it took. The screen test took place on December 3rd, 1952. Frank arrived at the studio 2 hours early, already in costume, having spent the morning getting into character. When the cameras rolled, something magical happened. All of Frank's pain, all of his desperation, all of his hunger to prove himself poured into his performance. He wasn't Frank Sinatra anymore. He was Private Angelo Maggio, a tough kid from Brooklyn who refused to be broken by a system that wanted to destroy him. It was electrifying. Zinnemann would later say, Frank disappeared completely into the character. You could see in his eyes that he wasn't acting, he was living it. Every emotion Maggio was supposed to feel, Frank was actually feeling. But the screen test was just the beginning of Frank's fight to get the role. Even after his powerful audition, the studio executives were reluctant to take a chance on him. The suits at Columbia were scared, recalled producer Buddy Adler. They kept asking, what if he can't handle a full movie? What if his voice problems affect his dialogue? What if he brings bad publicity to our picture? Frank knew that the executives were wavering, and he also knew that he might not get another chance like this. So on November 12, 1952 at 3:17 a.m., he picked up the phone and made the most important call of his career. He called Harry Cohn, the head of Columbia Pictures, at home. Cohn was not happy to be woken up in the middle of the night by a washed-up singer, but Frank's desperation gave him a kind of fearless honesty that cut through all the Hollywood bullshit. Mr. Cohn, I know you don't want to take a risk on me. I know I'm damaged goods right now. But I also know that you didn't get where you are by playing it safe. Frank paused, gathering his thoughts. You've got a great script, a great director, and a chance to make a movie that people will remember. But safe casting isn't going to make this movie special. Taking a chance on someone who's got everything to prove that might make it special. Cohn listened without interrupting. I'm not asking you to believe in me because of what I used to be. I'm asking you to believe in me because of who I am right now, a guy who's lost everything and has nothing left to lose. That's the guy you want playing Maggio. Frank's voice was steady now, filled with quiet conviction. Mr. Cohn, I will give you the best performance of my life. Not because I'm a great actor. I'm not yet, but because I understand this character in my bones. I know what it's like to be beaten down by circumstances beyond your control. I know what it's like to keep fighting when everyone expects you to quit. I know what it's like to be written off by people who used to respect you. Cohn was quiet for a long moment. Then he said 5 words that changed Frank's life. Kid, you've got the part. The 8-minute phone call that Frank would later credit with saving his career was actually much longer, over 30 minutes. But the crucial 8 minutes came at the end, when Cohn stopped seeing Frank as a has-been singer and started seeing him as an actor who had lived through the experiences his character would face. From Here to Eternity began filming in March 1953. Frank threw himself into the role with an intensity that surprised everyone on the set. He was professional, prepared, and completely committed to making the film succeed. Frank was like a man possessed, recalled Montgomery Clift, who played the lead role. He knew this was his comeback, and he wasn't going to waste it. He was first on set every morning and last to leave every night. He studied every scene, worked with the other actors, and never complained about anything. But Frank's real breakthrough came during the filming of Maggio's death scene. In the script, Maggio dies after being brutally beaten by sadistic guards, and his death serves as the catalyst for the film's climax. When they filmed the scene, Frank tapped into all the pain and humiliation he'd experienced during his career collapse. The vulnerability, the sense of being victimized by forces beyond his control, the desperate desire to maintain dignity even while being destroyed, it was all there in his performance. When Frank played that death scene, there wasn't a dry eye on the set. Zinnemann recalled. Grown men, tough Hollywood professionals were crying. We all realized we were watching something extraordinary. From Here to Eternity was released in August 1953 to universal critical acclaim. The film was praised for its realistic portrayal of military life, its strong performances, and its unflinching look at corruption and brutality in the peacetime army. But the biggest surprise was Frank Sinatra. Critics who had dismissed him as a lightweight entertainer suddenly found themselves writing about his raw, honest performance and his surprising dramatic range. Sinatra delivers a performance of stunning authenticity, wrote Bosley Crowther in the New York Times. He brings a combination of toughness and vulnerability to the role that transforms what could have been a stereotypical character into something genuinely moving. The film was nominated for 13 Academy Awards and won 8, including Best Picture. Frank was nominated for Best Supporting Actor, and on the night of March 25th, when Frank's name was called, he walked to the stage in a daze. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been a washed-up singer with no prospects. Now he was holding an Oscar. I want to thank everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, Frank said in his acceptance speech. But mostly, I want to thank everyone who didn't believe in me, because you made me work harder than I ever had to work before. The Oscar changed everything for Frank. Within months, he had a new recording contract with Capitol Records, new movie deals, and a renewed sense of purpose as both a singer and an actor. But more importantly, his experience making From Here to Eternity had taught Frank something crucial about his own talent. He wasn't just an entertainer anymore. He was an artist, capable of channeling his life experiences into performances that could move people. Losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to my career, Frank would later reflect. When I was on top, I was coasting. I was relying on natural talent and charm instead of really working on my craft. It took failure to teach me how to succeed. Frank's comeback was completed in 1955 when he released In the Wee Small Hours, an album of torch songs that showcased his new, more mature vocal style. The voice that had been damaged by his career collapse had healed differently, deeper, more expressive, capable of conveying emotions he'd never been able to access before. "The old Frank could sing happy songs," observed arranger Nelson Riddle, who worked on the album. "The new Frank could sing about heartbreak, loss, loneliness, all the things he'd experienced during his dark period. His voice had scars now, and scars tell stories." By 1956, Frank Sinatra was bigger than he'd ever been. He was making hit records, starring in successful movies, and performing to sold-out crowds around the world. But he never forgot the lessons he'd learned during his fall from grace. "Success is easy when you're young and hungry," Frank told a reporter in 1957. "The real test is whether you can handle failure with dignity and use it to become better than you were before. Most people let failure destroy them. I let it remake me." Frank's comeback became legendary in Hollywood, not just because of its dramatic scope, but because of what it proved about the power of persistence and self-reinvention. He had gone from the top to the bottom and back to the top again, emerging stronger and more talented than before. But perhaps the most important lesson from Frank's comeback wasn't about talent or persistence. It was about honesty. The moment Frank stopped pretending to be the person he used to be and started embracing who he had become, flawed, vulnerable, but determined, was the moment his career truly began again. "The old Frank was a character I played," he would later explain. "The new Frank was just me, with all my scars showing. And it turned out that people preferred the real thing." Frank Sinatra's career resurrection became a template for countless other performers who faced their own professional disasters. His story proved that failure didn't have to be final, that talent could be renewed, and that sometimes losing everything was the only way to discover what you were really capable of. But for Frank himself, the comeback was never really complete. Until the day he died, he carried with him the memory of that dark period when nobody wanted him, when his voice was gone, when his future seemed hopeless. And maybe that's what made his later success so meaningful. Frank Sinatra never again took his talent for granted. He never again assumed that success was permanent. And he never again forgot what it felt like to have to fight for every opportunity. "I've been to the bottom," Frank once said, "and I never want to go back, but I'm glad I went, because it taught me that the only thing that really matters is what you do when you think you're finished. Do you give up, or do you find a way to begin again?" Frank Sinatra chose to begin again, and in doing so, he created not just a comeback, but a second career that was even more remarkable than his first. The 8-minute phone call that saved his career was really just the beginning. The real comeback happened over months and years of hard work, honest self-assessment, and the determination to prove that failure could be transformed into something greater than success. Frank Sinatra never forgot that lesson, and neither should we.